Okay, we're moving on to our last speaker today, Dr. Vanessa Collingridge. Vanessa is an award-winning broadcaster, best-selling author, an academic and a leadership coach. After graduating from Oxford University with first-class honours in geography, she moved into television, specialising in science, environment, culture and history. Vanessa was born and brought up in Woking in Surrey, but she's lived in Scotland since 1989 and lives Lucky Heart on the shores of Castle Semple Loch near Loch Winnock. It must be beautiful out there. And she lives with her partner, their 4 young sons, a dog, 2 cats and an African pygmy hedgehog. That's a different one. Today, Vanessa will tell us the real story of the lifetimes and legacy of Captain James Cook, the greatest explorer in history who discovered Australia and New Zealand. The 3 great voyages of discovery pushed the borders of the British Empire to the ends of the earth. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you to everyone for having me along today. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Hang on a sec. Why can't I share a portion of my screen? Hang on a sec. Don't want that. Where's the advanced share? Okay, can we, hang on 2 secs. No. Can somebody help me share the screen sharing? No, I should be doing advanced screen sharing. You share, oh, here we go, brilliant, here we go, portion of screen. Thank you very much. I'll just get this in the right place. And can everybody see that now? Yep, great. Okay, well, as I said, thank you so much for having me along this afternoon. It is a genuine pleasure and an honour to be your final speaker for today. This year marks the 250th anniversary since His Majesty's bark Endeavour arrived back in Britain after 3 years circumnavigating the world on a scientific voyage of discovery. Now, in this age of mobile phones and GPS and satellite navigation, it's hard to get to grips with what it's like to really head off into the unknown. The nearest parallel, I'm guessing, is space, the final frontier. And years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to train to be the first cohort, really, of the space training program for tourists at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City in Russia. And when I was mixing with the other cosmonauts there, the ones who'd been up into space, I asked them, what's it like? And I was expecting some incredibly profound answer, instead of which I got a kind of glazed expression and the answer, well, you'll never understand unless you've been there. And while I was really disappointed in getting that as an answer, it did really underline the difference between true explorers and us mere mortals. It is a difference of imagination to be able to set your goal beyond the known horizon. But if we talk of space as the final frontier, I suppose the most famous spaceman is this one, Captain James Kirk. Starship Enterprise, of course, and his motto is, you can all say it out loud, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Well, that bears an uncanny correspondence with the subject of my talk today. Not Captain James Kirk, but Captain James Cook. And Captain James Cook's saying was, ambition drives me further than any other man has gone before me, perhaps as far as it's possible for a man to go. Okay, so given that the similarities, the very clear similarities between those 2 men, it was something of a relief when my publishers of my biography on Cook had his name writ large on the front cover of the first edition. This was particularly useful because I did have one university friend who, when I went to see her, she said, oh, Ness, I didn't know you were a Trekkie. And I'm like, no, Captain Cook, not Captain Kirk. Another friend emailed me and said, oh, hi, Ness, I hear you're writing an organic cookery book. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm writing a book on Captain Cook. But the funniest thing was when we were filming the TV series that went along with my book. It was a 4-part big ABC Discovery History Channel series. We were filming in New Zealand, and typically, as you do, you get people coming up to you, and this guy came up to us and said, oh, excuse me, I can't do a New Zealand accent. He said, excuse me, what are you guys filming? And I said, oh, we're making a drama documentary series about Captain Cook. And he said, Captain Cook, great, I love pirates. So yeah, to avoid any confusion, and if you are in the wrong lecture, you can have my total blessing to switch off now. For the next 20-25 minutes or so, we will not be talking about Star Trek, cookery, or pirates, but instead we're going to be talking about this man, Captain James Cook. Here's a portrait of his, done by Nathaniel Dance, painted in 1776. Now, this was painted in London after his second of 3 epic voyages. He's shown here wearing his full captain's regalia, and he achieved that rank not in the first voyage, but after the second voyage, shortly before the second voyage in August 1775. And you can see he's got a chart in front of him, one of his maps in front of him, and he's pointing to the east coast of Australia, because that, as we heard in the introduction, is one achievement that he is most famous for. But why, of all the great explorers and naval officers and great figures in history, does James Cook really stand out? Well, quite simply, I believe James Cook is arguably the greatest explorer this world has ever seen. So in terms of his achievements, in 3 epic voyages, he travelled a distance equivalent to sailing to the moon. He discovered more of this Earth than any other human being, putting 1/3 of the world we know today on the map. He charted the Pacific from the Arctic to the Antarctic, charting and claiming for the West, New Zealand, the east coast of Australia, including the Great Barrier Reef. He also crossed the Arctic Circle, and then the Antarctic Circle 3 times, reaching a remarkable 71 degrees south, and therefore becoming the person who went further than any other man had ever been before him. He charted and discovered for the West, of course, the indigenous populations had kind of got there first, the Hawaiian Islands, South Georgia, the New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, much of Tonga, Fiji, the Society Islands, the west coast of America, much of Canada, and also Alaska. Now, his maps are so accurate, they're still used well into the 20th century and indeed the 21st centuries. I used James Cook's maps when I sailed down to the Antarctic from the Falkland Islands back in 2002 to 3. He exploded the myth of the Great Southern Continent, that seawater couldn't freeze, as people believed in the 18th century, and that also New Guinea was joined to Australia. He also conquered scurvy, which killed more people than war ever did. You banked on losing about half of every single crew on a long distance voyage to scurvy. And he also, importantly, pioneered modern scientific cartography, and also championed, I'm sure many of you know about John Harrison's chronometer. He championed the use of the chronometer on his 2nd and 3rd voyages to find longitude, to work out longitude. He also pioneered an incredibly enlightened attitude to the indigenous people he met that really shattered all conventions from the times. And he collected a huge amount of data on ocean currents, winds, the shape of the seafloor, depth of the seafloor, on anthropology and also natural history. And on top of all that, He fathered 6 children in just around 4 years of being together with his wife, which is perhaps the biggest achievement of all. But aside from all of these classic achievements, I knew when I was researching James Cook that we knew very, very little about the inner world of the man. What is it that makes someone leave the safety of land to sail thousands of miles in a leaky wooden ship the length of 3 double-decker buses onto a blank space on the map? What is it that drove him further than any other man, perhaps as far as it's possible for a man to go? So in my research, what started out as the story of a man to go 3 times further than any other man suddenly exploded into 2 incredible but very different journeys. The first journey across the oceans and off the known map of the world. And the second journey was my journey into the secret, hidden inner world of this most private of public naval heroes. So let's do a little bit about his backstory then. Where did he come from? Well, unlike most of the 18th century heroes or celebrities, he was born in 1728 in Marton in Cleveland, the barefoot son of a farm labourer. He was born to a Scottish dad and a Yorkshire mum, and his dad's boss, very early on in James Cook's life, realised there was something special about the boy. And his dad's boss, Tom Scotto, paid for 4 years schooling in what's called a petty school in the village. But that was really the only formal education he had. But because he was really good with numbers and clearly very bright, instead of going to have a career on the land, he got a job in Staithes on the coast for William Sanderson, who was a grocer. And he spent a few years working as a grocer's assistant. But at age 18, he decided instead not to continue as a shop worker, but to join the Merchant Navy. Staithes is just down the coast from Whitby, which was one of the centres of the 18th century Merchant Navy and the centre of the coal trade at that time. So he went across the moors and went to Whitby, where he was apprenticed by a very famous set of Whitby colliers, Whitby coal ship owners, called John and Henry Walker. And they had a fleet of ships that were big workhorses of the sea. They were called Whitby Cats, and they were famous because they had very, very large hulls, very flat bottoms for taking huge amounts of coal up and down the coast to London. Now, he showed real skill. So in just 4 years of his apprenticeship, he was promoted to master's mate. And that could have seen him set up for life. He would have been very comfortably off. He would have been held in very high esteem in his communities. But instead of settling for that, what does he do? Well, James Cook goes to London and signs on with the Royal Navy at the lowest possible level. He signs on as an ordinary seaman. And the only clue we have from any of his writings is that he writes to John Walker, his lifelong mentor, that he had in mind to try his fortune that way. But although he signed on as a very, very basic seaman, ordinary seaman, within 1 month he'd been recognised as somebody who was very skillful and was promoted back up to his previous rank of master's mate. Within a year, Britain had become embroiled in the 7 Years' War against France, and his ships took part in harrying attacks against the French in the English Channel and in the Atlantic. And again, by 1757, the next year, his skill was recognised and he was promoted to ship's master, responsible therefore for navigation. And navigation and just understanding the technical side of being a ship's navigator was something that really resonated with James Cook. He was sent in 1758 in HMS Pembroke under Captain John Simcoe to Halifax in the north of Canada, the eastern coast of Canada. And there he took part in a number of offences, including the Battle of Louisburg. And as the French town was smouldering from the assault by the British in the background, James Cook decided to go for a walk along the beach. And there he met a young man called Samuel Holland, who was a military engineer and surveyor. Now, Samuel had a strange kind of table with some paper on it, and he seemed to be drawing on that paper. Cook walked up to him and asked what he was doing, and Holland explained he was making something called a survey, a mathematical map of the town. Now, it seems bizarre to us now, doesn't it? But Cook had never actually heard of this before, a mathematical survey. Because in those days, you sailed by what are called sailing directions. They were literally written directions, like a list. You sail across the ocean until you see this headline, and there'd be a picture of that headline that somebody would have drawn, and you identified like sort of significant landmarks. And then you would follow like a written list of instructions to find where you needed to go. We didn't have this visual culture of maps back in the 18th century. So Cook was really about 20 years ahead of his time, but he immediately saw the value of doing these mathematical surveys and its value for navigation. And so he said to Samuel Holland, can you teach me how to do this? And invited him on board to the ship. And basically that winter, Cook came up with this map. This is his first ever printed map, a draft of the bay and harbour of Gaspé in Canada, 1758. And he made this while being basically iced into the harbour in the very hard winters there when they couldn't sail. Halifax sits at the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. And it was there, they were waiting for the St. Lawrence River to defrost, basically, to get rid of its ice so that they could sail up in their campaign to conquer Canada. Now, Lord Colville sent a letter to the Admiralty when he saw this map, describing Cook as a man of, quote, genius and capacity. And that saying was incredibly important. It marked Cook out back home to the Admiralty, and they knew that they had something special on their hands. Cook again used these new surveying skills as soon as the ice melted, helping 140 British ships make it safely up the treacherous St. Lawrence River to win the Battle of Quebec against the French in 1759. And that battle effectively defeated the French and won Canada for Britain. Now, Cook stayed on in Canada as the King's surveyor, mapping the territories that Britain had won and also some territories that Britain was going to cede to the French in a kind of compensation factor. But after almost 5 years in Canada, in 1762, he arrived home in London, aged 34. Now, of course, in Canada, there wasn't a great amount to spend your money on. So he had quite a bit of money saved up. And what does a young man do who's got quite a bit of money? Well, he looks for a wife. And this, we think, is the picture of Elizabeth Batts. Not her when she was 21, when Cook met her, but her much later in life. They got married very, very quickly. They got married within a few months. And she went on to give Cook those 6 children and live well into her 90s. But she served over 50 years of those as his widow. Now, in 1768, the British government, the Admiralty and the Royal Society came together to devise arguably the first ever state-sponsored scientific voyage of discovery, a journey around the world. And these are the plans for the ship that they chose. It was one of those Whitby cats that I was talking about. Very unusual in the time for being one of His Majesty's ship. Normally there'd be a very elegant warship or something like that. But this time they knew in a 3-year voyage, you needed a hefty workhorse of a ship with a huge amount of storage. So a coal ship is absolutely perfect for that. And also a ship with a very flat bottom, so you could sail close into the land and make accurate surveys of the places you were encountering. So where was she headed and why? Well, look at this. This is the kind of map that Cook would have encountered when he was planning his voyage. It's a map of the Pacific from the middle of the 17th century. But it really had changed very little by 1768 when Cook was planning his voyage. This is what the Pacific looked like. Now, if you take a close look, there is very, very little on this map. California, if you can see California up there, is represented as an island. The whole northwest of America is missing from California upwards, and so are most of the Pacific Islands. There's a tiny little snatch down in the bottom left-hand quadrant of what we now know as New Zealand, but this was the land discovered by Abel Tasman, and he thought it was part of this mythical great southern continent. There's also a little snatch of part of Australia, and again this was thought to be part of this great continent called the Great Southern Continent. But the reason why this map is significant is that in 1769 a rare astronomical event was due to take place called the transit of Venus. Now this transit of Venus, the planet Venus across the disk of the sun, had been predicted by the astronomer Sir Edmund Halley at the start of the 18th century. But the thing about these astronomical events is that they happen every 100 years. And then they happen two in close succession, about 6-7 years apart, and then you have to wait another 100 years before the next one. Now, the first of these two related events had been lost to scientists because it was during the 7 Years' War. This next one in 1769 was the last chance for astronomers to measure and map the transit of Venus across the disk of the sun for 100 years. So why was this important to the Royal Navy and the Royal Society? Enough to send 100 men halfway across the world to view it? Well, in the days before the chronometer had been invented to measure longitude, you had to measure longitude by using the stars. You had to essentially navigate and find your position by the stars, working out your longitude by a horrendous series of mathematical calculations. And these needed to be accurate, otherwise you didn't really know where you were in the world. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of John Harrison's effort to do this by making his famous clock or chronometer. And I had the privilege of trying to do it the old-fashioned way. You used to do it before you had the discovery of, or the invention of the chronometers. And I can promise you, it takes hours to work out mathematically where you are by using navigation tables, longitude tables, and mathematical calculations. So it really does show why this potential to accurately map the heavens and therefore make your navigation tables more accurate was so important. Now, transit observers were being sent to the North Cape in Norway, Hudson's Bay in Canada, but for the correct triangulation, you really needed somebody in the middle of the Southern Hemisphere, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But where? You can see on this map, we just didn't know any of the islands that we now know exist there. Then, in summer of 1768, Captain Samuel Wallis returned from his circumnavigation around the world with news of a discovery of an island we would know as Tahiti. And this was positioned slap bang in the middle of the most perfect area for doing the transit of Venus observations. But that wasn't all. Along with the transit, there was a second secret reason for the voyage. In 1768, geographers, and indeed most of the people in the Western Hemisphere, believed there was a great southern continent, a land, you can see it depicted here on this map, full of 50 million people, a land to rival Asia with its silks and spices, its gold and silver and diamonds and precious commodities. And the country that discovered it would become the richest nation on earth. And Britain, of course, wanted that glory for itself. The transit of Venus was important, yes, it certainly was, but the real prize, the really hotly contested prize, was in this continent that, as you can see on this map, stretched from the Spice Islands and New Guinea right the way down to the South Pole. Abel Tasman had said that he had seen a snatch of its coastline when he had been exploring the Pacific Ocean in 1642. And many other sailors had reported seeing snatches of land, areas of land, sites of land. The race was therefore on across the maritime nations of the world to find it, to map it, and to claim it for their own. But who to lead the voyage? Well, James Cook, of course. This man of, remember the words, genius and capacity in the art of map making, was also a very, very skilled astronomer and an extremely fine sailor. The trouble was, remember at the time he was still only officially a ship's master, so hardly suitable to sail His Majesty's bark Endeavour. So just before they set sail in the summer of 1768, he was officially given the commission of lieutenant. So he became Lieutenant James Cook, and he was put in command of 100 men, as including officers and crew, and also the botanist, later Sir Joseph Banks. So this motley crew of 100 men sailed south to Cape Horn, round Cape Horn, into the Pacific, and then onwards to Tahiti, arriving here several months later in April 1769, with about a month to go before the transit. So they set up camp and an observatory ready for the transit of Venus in June. But when it came, things didn't quite work out as planned. There was an optical illusion called the black drop effect, meaning it was impossible to get the exact time when Venus connected with the rim of the sun. They did get some figures, but basically Cook just skims over that and says, yes, we got our figures, and then moves on. But this was the moment Cook opened his secret second set of sealed orders, which said to head south to 40 degrees in search of the fabled continent. Now, this would have been extremely hard for Cook, except that when he was in Tahiti, he had been asked by a Polynesian priestly navigator called Tupaia and his assistant if they could come on the journey too. Now, the more Cook got to know Tupaia, the more he marveled at the Polynesians' remarkable sailing skills and navigating skills. And little wonder, remember that empty map of the Pacific? Well, when they set sail from Tahiti, heading 40 degrees south in line with Cook's orders, Tupaia said, oh, if we go a little bit further on, we'll find this island and then that island. And then, oh yeah, over to your left will be this island. And Cook is like blown away in the ship's cabin that Tupaia was able to accurately predict every single piece of land that they came across, even if it wasn't represented or known to the west. Well, here is the map that Tupaia eventually sat down and drew for Cook in 1769 in the great cabin of the Endeavour, showing all the Pacific islands in the vicinity. And it really is an astounding piece of work. But if you look closely at it, it's not like a typical map that we would see in Western culture. Look how the islands are almost laid out in a spiral. Now, this map has baffled cartographers for centuries, but literally just a few years ago, some researchers finally cracked the code of the way of thinking of the Polynesian navigators. So this is not drawn according to our kind of grids of latitude and longitude lines, but by the winds, the time taken, along with the direction that you set out with and the position of the sun. It's a really strange but very, very effective way of mapping, of charting your cosmology. And despite the fact that Tupaia had drawn all of this from memory, it is mind-bogglingly accurate when it's transferred onto a Mercator-style typical grid system that we use today. So this system of navigating and Cook's own knowledge very skillfully got them down to the land that had been seen by Abel Tasman. And the officers on board said, we've discovered the continent, and there's much sort of joy. But Cook all the way through says, I don't think so. Cook is reading the swell. He is reading the way the waves come. He is reading the matter that's brought in on the waves. And he maintained this isn't part of the continent. This is an island. And he and the officers had a constructive argument about whether it was the continent or whether it was the island. And Cook just very calmly kept his counsel and sailed around the lands, proving that it wasn't the fabled continent after all, but two islands, the North and South Island of New Zealand. And he added these to the map of the world. He also developed really good relations with the Maori group after an initial sort of conflict or two. But these friendships would sustain him his entire life, and New Zealand became one of his favourite places in the world. Okay, but when he had charted New Zealand and proven that it was not part of the great southern continent, he'd essentially finished his mission, his military orders. So now it was time to go home. But rather than going home by the quickest route, Cook, ever the explorer, decided to take a little detour and explore the chart the previously unknown east coast of New Holland, what we now call modern Australia, claiming it for the British. And they left New Zealand and arrived here in April 1770. And they arrived and landed in Botany Bay. And here alone, in just 1 week of collecting, they increased the number of plants known to the West by 25%. Now, the botanist Joseph Banks was in absolute heaven, and it made such an impression on him. He would later be the key person championing the idea of setting up Britain's first penal colony here in Botany Bay in 1788. Now, while they were in Botany Bay, they also saw a strange animal jumping, as swift as a deer and the colour of a mouse. It only would take several months before they could find out that its name was kangaroo. But not everything here was a success in Australia. The Aboriginal groups largely kept their distance from these ghostly white strangers. They really just ignored them and tried to keep their distance. Then halfway up the coast, disaster struck, and the Endeavour smashed into the infamous Great Barrier Reef, almost killing everybody on board as the ship was stuck there for 23.5 hours, taking on water. The men manned the pumps and did an ingenious device. One of the ship's surgeons actually jumped overboard with a sail that had been lined with dung and straw, and basically used it a bit like a sticking plaster, and managed to sort of put a plaster over the wound, over the big hole in the side of the ship. And that bought them enough time to limp to shore into what's now Cooktown in Queensland, where they managed to mend this gaping hole in the side of the ship and also developed their first relations with the Aborigines here. And the Aborigines were amazingly, once they built up a friendship, they provided them with food and also the name of that kangaroo creature. 6 weeks later, with the ship mended, they had to have that horrible decision to once again try and cross the Great Barrier Reef. And it was a very nervous, tense moment, as you can see in Cook's journals. But eventually they managed to float over it on the high tide and head home via the Spice Islands and South America, arriving home to a rapturous audience with the king and a very impressed Admiralty. So this is a quick look at his route. You can see goes round South America, up to Tahiti, around to New Zealand, Australia, up to Batavia, what's now Jakarta, then round the Cape of Good Hope and back home. Now, unfortunately, we just don't have time to go through all 3 of his voyages, but he did make another 2 epic voyages. The first one, as you can see, is in red. The second one is in green, these 2 giant sweeps of the Pacific Ocean, again, to search for this mythical Great Southern Continent. And this is the one that took him to the frozen wastes of the Antarctic, crossing the Antarctic Circle 3 times and reaching that astounding 71 degrees south before being driven back by ice. And then his final voyage, you can see, goes in the other direction to conquer the other great geographical myth of the age, the Northwest Passage to Asia. And it was while travelling north that he came across another set of previously unknown islands called Hawaii. And so when he was driven back by the ice as the winter season was encroaching, he sailed back south and tried to overwinter here. He arrived in Hawaii in Kealakekua Bay in early 1779 and was greeted by the remarkable sight of 10,000 Hawaiians paddling out to meet him in these great canoes laden with fruit and veg and all kinds of gifts. And you can even, if you look closely, just to the left-hand side of the ship that's centre with the sail, the kind of triangular sail, you'll see the world's first depiction of a man on a surfboard. Now, at first, The Hawaiians treated the visitors with the respect given to great chiefs, or perhaps even kind of demigods. But Cook and his men, frankly, overstayed their welcome. They depleted much of the islanders' food in this season of feasting. And when an argument broke out on Valentine's Day 1779, Cook went ashore to try to restore order. But in a travesty of confusion and misjudgments, he was instead bludgeoned to death by stones and stabbed with the very daggers his own blacksmiths had traded with the Hawaiians. It was the end of an astounding career, one that had added a third of the lands we know today and the oceans to the map of the world. His men, including the ship's master, the future Captain Bligh of Bounty fame, and George Vancouver, who was one of the officers who would later give his name to part of Canada in future explorations inspired by his time with James Cook, they sailed the ships home, utterly bereft and heartbroken, knowing that they had lost one of the best sailors the world has ever seen. The news of Cook's death took 11 months to reach Britain from letters sent overland via Kamchatka in Asia. Cook was proclaimed an icon of the British Empire, one of the greats, and you can see him here, raised up to the heavens by the fates. His wife Elizabeth was now a widow at just 38, after just 4 years of life with her husband. She would live another 56 years, and tragically, all 6 of her children would die childless before her. The final 3, one was murdered, one drowned, and the final son, who didn't go to sea, he died as a student at Cambridge of scarlet fever. Born in the age of reason, James Cook died in the age of romance and celebrity, with Joseph Banks as his spin doctor. Soon you could buy everything from James Cook mugs to James Cook wallpaper. The quiet, studious, serious, genius explorer would have hated the public icon he had now become. I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and I'd like to just reflect a little on, I suppose, really the lessons we can draw from the life and times of Captain James Cook. As I said at the start, it's really hard to put yourself in the mind of an 18th century explorer. But I've now had a lifetime studying Cook and his times and the worlds in which he lived from both sides, from both the indigenous side and the Western side, and what happens when those two cultures collide. So, as I said, what lessons can we draw from this remarkable life? Well, I think the first one is a really strong belief in the need for diversity and inclusivity. Cook, unlike most of his contemporaries, had not been poshly educated like most of the officers he'd sailed with. So he had a very different way of thinking and seeing the world. He wasn't classically educated with all, you know, the long-standing 2,000-year-long myth of the great southern continent. He took things as he saw them. He wasn't constrained by convention. As a humble farmer's son, he respected the indigenous cultures he encountered. He reckoned that he was very similar to a lot of them, especially civilizations like the Maori civilization, the Polynesians. And he treated many of the indigenous people he encountered, such as Tupaia, absolutely as his equal, inviting them into the great cabin, listening to them, hearing what they had to say. So that's the first lesson. The second great lesson that Cook knew all too well: you don't achieve great success on your own. Although he might have been the figurehead, on each of his ships, there were about 100 men, each one with their own vital role to play to keep the ships afloat and exploring. Cook would have done nothing without teamwork. He would have achieved nothing without teamwork. And it's not just at sea, even on land, he also had his mentors. We've been hearing about the importance of mentors in our previous talk. But these mentors were people who'd spotted him as a rising star, who'd nurtured his career. And don't forget the indigenous people of the Pacific who had helped him by giving him vital geographical information, local information, food, water, and also language skills to really understand what the cultures were that he was encountering. Another lesson is basically timing. He was the right man at the right time, but you can only be the right person at the right time if you seize the opportunities that are presented. Now, for Cook, scientific cartography was really just starting in line with the British imperial project to map and control the world. And don't forget as well, the 18th century witnessed the rise of science and enlightened thinking when you're trying to make sense of what's around you. But also, newspapers had only just really taken off in the 18th century. They're an 18th century phenomenon, along with much more print media. And what you had, just as we get today, is a barrage of fake news. We didn't know in the 18th century, just as we're struggling today, how to discern fact from fiction. A lot of people spouted a pile of guff and printed it as fact. And the readers didn't really know what was fact and what was fiction. So Cook quickly realized, when his own first voyage journal was written up by a journalist who wrote it up as very sensationalized, he knew from that moment he needed to control the message. And he took on board the writing of his own journals and insisted on having final sight of those before they went to press. Another great lesson from Cook, and again this is echoed by Ashley's talk, is the need for compassion. Cook saw people of all kinds as people, not as social stereotypes, not as racial stereotypes. He could equally talk to the ordinary seaman and the Lords of the Admiralty. He could talk to the king, but he could equally talk to a Maori farmer. And I think we can see some of this. There's been lots of talk recently, especially with the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a kind of revisioning of history. There's been a lot of talk, is Cook an imperialist? Should we tear down all his statues? And I think this is one of those moments when you need to pause and take breath and really look behind those easy stereotypes to the man behind the icon myth. And I would like to read you out very briefly a quick sentence that Cook wrote when he was talking about the peoples of the Pacific that he was encountering. It's to our shame as civilized Christians, we debauch their morals and introduce amongst their wants and perhaps diseases, introduce among them wants and perhaps diseases which they never before knew and which serves only to disturb the happy tranquility that they and their forefathers had enjoyed. If anyone denies the truth of this assertion, let him tell me what the natives of the whole extent of America have gained by commerce with Europeans. This is not somebody who went out into the wider world to dominate and subjugate the peoples he encountered. Far from it. He was learning from them. He was reproducing the knowledge on maps, and those maps, yes, became part of a British imperial project, but he was going out there as a scientist through and through. So I think one lesson for us now, when we look at hindsight, when we look at the stories in our history, is to really know that history, you have to be very cautious about looking back with 2020 hindsight. We learn, we grow, we develop, we understand different things. Yes, Cook was a mythbuster of the great southern continent. He had a huge number of achievements, but he didn't get it all right. He conquered scurvy, yes, but he didn't really understand exactly how. He thought poor hygiene played a role in scurvy as well as food. Also, he thought he was doing a favour by introducing non-native animal species and plants to help the indigenous populations. Of course, we now know that was a really, really bad idea. We wouldn't do it now, but he was doing it with good intentions. But I think perhaps the biggest lesson, and the one I'd like to finish with, is that life, like history, is actually really complex. Cook is seen by many as this imperial icon, but he had his demons, his moods, his tantrums, his mental health sort of very profound mental health problems and his mistakes. But it's easier, isn't it, especially once your hero is dead, to shape them and mold them into the person that makes your life easy, because they can then be representing anything that you want them to represent. So it's easier to believe a simple lie about an individual's history or a nation's history than the very complex truth. And the man behind the myth of Captain James Cook is much more fascinating than this cookie cutter version that's taught to us in school. We need, as a generation now, to acknowledge and try to understand the very complex realities behind these cookie cutter histories. And I would argue, this is also my finishing point, that this is where true understanding and greatness lies. Thank you very much.